Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. So today we're going to be talking about trig and trig reciprocal functions, and also, surprise, it's chain rule time. So before we get started, I need you to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. So some of the stuff we did in class, so you may have a little bit of a repeat here, but that is okay. So we have our 4 trig functions that are not sine or cosine, and we get these. Answer is for our derivatives of, the derivative of tangent is secant squared. The derivative of cotangent is negative cosecant squared. The derivative of secant is secant x tangent x being multiplied together. And the derivative of cosecant is negative cosecant x cotangent x. So we're going to talk about why those become what they do. So tangent is the exact same thing as saying sine divided by cosine. So one of the things that we know is quotient rule now. So we now know quotient rule. I like using v's. So if I have something u over v and I want to take the derivative of it, we're going to have the derivative of the top times the original of the bottom minus the derivative of the bottom times the original of the top, all divided by the denominator squared. So the original denominator squared. So if I were to do that here, f prime of x is equal to the derivative of sine is cosine times cosine minus the derivative of cosine, which is negative sine, times sine, all divided by cosine squared. So cosine times cosine is cosine squared, minus a negative turns into a positive, and sine times sine is sine squared. Sine squared plus cosine squared is one of our Pythagorean identities, which means we know that it is always going to be 1. So we have 1 now, divided by cosine squared x. 1 over cosine is the same thing as secant, so 1 over cosine squared would be equal to secant squared of x. So this is kind of the work that we go through to kind of figure it out, and this is why it ends up the way it does. If we were to look at cotangent, we just have to remind ourselves that cotangent is that reciprocal of sine over cosine, so cosine over sine. So we would do the same thing. So the derivative of cosine is negative sine times sine minus the derivative of sine, which is cosine times cosine. And we are going to divide that by sine squared this time. So we have negative sine squared minus cosine squared divided by sine squared x. So what we're going to do is we're going to factor out a negative from everything in the top, so that way we can get that Pythagorean identity. So I have negative that I'm just going to pull out. We have sine squared x plus cosine squared x now, divided by sine squared. Well, sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, so I have negative 1 divided by sine squared. 1 over sine is cosecant, so 1 over sine squared would be cosecant squared. And because we have that negative 1, we now have negative cosecant squared of x. These ones are pretty straightforward. The big thing is that you have to know about sine squared plus cosine squared, or factoring out the negative to kind of help us out. Secant and cosecant are a little bit different, and the reason why is because we still have to use quotient rule, but 1 is one of our 2 functions. So I have 1 on the top, cosine on the bottom. So if I take the derivative of the top, that's 0, times cosine, minus the derivative of cosine, which is negative sine, times 1, divided by cosine squared. Well, 0 times cosine goes away. We have minus a negative, so that turns into a positive, and sine of x times 1, so sine times, or divided by cosine squared. Well, in order to get what we really want here, we need to rewrite this in a different way. So one of the things that we need to remind ourselves is that cosine squared is the same thing as cosine times cosine. I can also write sine as 1 times sine. And I know that for sure because we literally started with that. And this is one of those things that seems counterintuitive, but we do this so that way we can separate this into two fractions. So I have 1 over cosine of x times sine over cosine of x. 1 over cosine of x is what we started with. That is secant. On the other hand, sine over cosine is tangent, which gives us our secant x times tangent of x. And then our last one, cosecant, is 1 over sine. So the derivative of 1 times sine of x minus the derivative of sine times 1, all divided by sine squared. This time we don't have minus a negative, so that negative is still a part of it. So I have a negative 1 times cosine of x, and we are going to divide it by, we're going to go ahead and split up sine squared into sine times sine. Well, I can now split up my two fractions, so 1 over sine of x times cosine x over sine x. This gives me 1 over sine, which is cosecant, and cosine over sine, which is cotangent, and then I have a negative out front, so negative cosecant x, cotangent x. For both of these, our derivative could be tangent x, secant x, or cotangent x, cosecant x. That multiplication doesn't matter what order we do stuff in.